Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the IIRSM East Midlands branch meeting. We're lucky to have with us today Claire Forshaw, who's the Professional Head of Health and Wellbeing for RSSB and Founder and Director of UK HCA. Claire's going to be talking to us about sound today. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining this session this afternoon. Nice to virtually meet you all. So yeah, I guess this conversation today is really about looking at the kind of modern challenges of noise and hearing health in our workplaces, in the role we have as safety and risk professionals. A bit of a thought piece really about the challenges we still face and any kind of new and emerging ones. So I've had a kind of long history of dealing with noise and hearing health from my role back in HSE for many years, where I was involved from the health and the occupational hygiene and the safety side. And that's kind of carried me through my career when we set up the UK HCA. And I'll just do a bit of an introduction to the UK Hearing Conservation Association, for which I am a founder and a director of. So we set up this association back in 2019, so a few years ago now, and it really was off the back of a model that we are completely emulating, it's pinching with pride, as they say, from the US, where they have a National Hearing Conservation Association out there. And the idea is that we are completely multidisciplinary, so it's not a kind of one professional body approach, which I think is really important in this topic and this challenge that we face. We look to provide a holistic view of the challenge around hearing health and noise, and we are also independent, so anybody who is a member who has a particular commercial interest leaves that at the door, and we come together as passionate individuals interested in promoting the protection of our nation's hearing health and all preventable causes of hearing conditions related to noise and sound exposure. So that's who we are, and I'll talk a bit more later about how you might want to get involved with us. So I guess we'll start with a question of, have we got a problem? Is noise still a problem? And I'd like to think that, you joining us today suggests that, you recognise that there's still a challenge around noise in our workplace. It is one of our oldest known industrial diseases, and I think that does throw up a particular challenge for us in moving on from how we've always done things around this topic and area. And there was a recent report published, if you're not aware about it, and I can copy the link after the session. The HSE asked their expert health committee, the Workplace Health Expert Committee, specifically the WEC committee, back in 2023 to look at noise exposure and to produce a report which is titled "The Likely Prevalence of Noise-Induced Hearing Loss Across GB Industry." And unfortunately for me, at the time when this report was published, it did suggest that there was less of an issue around noise exposure in our industries now, that there was less noisy industry. So with the reduction of our maybe more traditional heavy industries reducing, that there was less exposure probably likely. And the other kind of summary assumption, if you like, was that there was much better hearing protection now available. So noise is less of a problem. But obviously, the big challenge there is that we do not have a lot of data around the prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss. So again, with it being one of our oldest exposure scenarios in the workplaces, we're not really very well at tracking and trending how many cases of ill health we actually have related to noise exposure at work. And I would suggest that although we may have less of our traditional noisy industry still here in GB, that there are different noise exposures or different noisy workplaces where it may be lower levels of noise, but possibly for longer periods. So things like maybe not obviously noisy workplaces, but coffee shops, restaurants, we get a lot of complaints and questions around gyms and leisure centres, and even things like call centres where people might be listening to audible content for long shifts, but wouldn't typically be thought of as a noisy job or a noisy industry. So I think, I'd like to say there is a problem with noise, but we probably have an issue with actually quantifying that and presenting how big that problem is. But some data and information you might be interested to see is from the Claims Recovery Unit at DWP, where I'm presenting here the top 10 occupational diseases for which successful claims of industrial injuries benefit were made. And you can see, I'm sure many of the common occupational diseases you would expect to see up there. But those with a keen eye will probably notice actually there's only 9 on the screen at that point, because occupational deafness by far and beyond dwarfs successful claims for other occupational diseases. So over 5 times more successful claims for occupational deafness. Yes, this is related to historic exposure, but there is quite a high bar to meet to be able to be successful for those claims. So there is still a lot of data and information to suggest that noise exposure and hearing health is still a challenge that we're not tackling, that we're not reducing, we're not making an impact against. And I think it's also interesting to reflect on kind of societal changes and shifts, which is something I wanted to explore really with you today. The profile of noise exposure is certainly changing around kind of personal listening habits. I mean, you can't walk down the street or use public transport without, walking past probably the majority of people who will be plugged in or wearing over-ear headphones, listening to some, I say, audible content as they travel or move around or go about their business. That's got to be adding to the noise health burden for our society. And I think another challenge around this topic is around our attitude towards our hearing. Most people assume that we lose our hearing as we age, and we've talked a lot, I think, historically about presbyacusis, age-related hearing loss, and the addition of noise-induced hearing loss, what we would expect typically to have lost in our lifetime, and then add on what might be due to exposure to noise in our workplace. But actually, presbyacusis, age-related hearing loss, is all noise and sound-related hearing loss. So actually, we could really protect our future hearing health by looking at our whole life kind of exposure to noise and sound in our environment, in our leisure activities, as well as our workplaces. And maybe then we could get over this attitude then, well, I'm going to go deaf anyway, it's inevitable in my life. So I think that kind of attitudes towards the health outcome of exposure to noise is something that we should really try to overcome and address. And probably most of you are familiar with the kind of idea of synergistic effects. And the example, I think, which is most commonly known and understood is the link with smoking and asbestosis or exposure to asbestos. So, if we think about, probably an additive effect, we do know that impulse noise in particular can be more harmful than continuous noise, and that kind of synergistic effect of being exposed to impactful noises in the workplace alongside that kind of background continuous exposure is probably synergistic. But there's certainly going to be some additive effects of leisure noise and work noise, and also thinking something we don't usually consider when we do risk assessments and look at exposure profile in workplaces is the exposure to ototoxic substances, which again can be synergistic or additive in their impact on hearing health. and I have a number of references that I can share with you if you're interested in understanding more about ototoxicity and exposure to various chemicals and issues like medicines, which can increase the risk and increase the impact on hearing health outcomes. And I'm sure many of you have already heard about the link that's been made between cognitive decline and hearing loss. And a lot of this comes from a research that was published in The Lancet a few years ago, where it's been demonstrated that hearing loss is actually the biggest modifiable factor for early onset of dementia. So the research is certainly established a clear correlation of hearing loss with early onset of dementia. The actual causal pathway has not yet been fully understood or explored. There are hypotheses around a lack of neural stimulus from the auditory pathway. There's also issues about hearing loss being related to reduced social interaction or communication difficulties, and whether those issues could contribute to the higher risk factor for dementia. But I must say this kind of area of health impact has certainly created a lot more attention on the subject of noise and sound exposure. We've been sort of talking about this, and I've certainly been talking around this topic for very many years. But I think that idea of the hearing loss being related to cognitive decline has certainly grabbed a lot more attention than the you will go deaf or you may get tinnitus. This has been the one that people seem to be most concerned about as a potential outcome, and anything that sort of gets more attention and helps us realise the impact that the noise and sound has can only be a good thing to help us prevent these outcomes in the future. And we talk a lot about the concerns around mental health in our workplace, and noise is a stressor. We know how our bodies react as if it's been assaulted when in a noisy environment. And it's also, again, been linked to cardiovascular risk, where it was found that for every 5 decibel increase in your average 24-hour noise level, it was associated with a 34% increase in heart attacks, strokes, and other serious health-related outcomes. So just trying to make the case that, we've had noise for a long time. We might not have a lot of great data in terms of health outcomes, but there's certainly a lot of knowledge that we do have about the impact this has on people related to the exposures that we're pretty familiar with. And so after 2019, we set up the UK HCA. We're in 2025 now, so 6 years later. I'm hoping that kind of campaign and awareness raising that we've been driving is leading to some change and a shift in attitudes and approach to the challenges we face. And I'm certainly pleased to see that the regulator in Great Britain, the Health and Safety Executive, is now delivering a focused campaign on the issue of noise, if you're not aware of it. And this is the first time they've looked at this topic in over 20 years. And the last time they did this was when the control and noise at work regulations were implemented. But this is a huge campaign that they're rolling out over 5 years. And it is certainly, whether the tide is turning, it's certainly causing some waves out there in industry. And rightly so. I said, we've had this issue for a long time. And just look at this research report from the HSE from back in 2009. And I would suggest nothing probably has changed since then. We're still chucking out earplugs, hearing protection, and people can't hear properly using them. People don't use them properly, and they interface with other PPE, suitability for the environment, etc. So, the fact that we're not innovating, we're not progressing in this topic area, is partly the reason that HSE are now taking this seriously, going out there and taking action. And again, That was a HSE report, some other research and evidence here from Elliot Berger in the States, who works for 3M or has worked for 3M, just to demonstrate the difference between the noise rating of hearing protection and the actual protection that can be achieved. So that kind of noise reduction levels projected with the products that are purchased, and the orange to say what was actually measured, with various uses of earplugs on the top. So we can see, there's a huge reduction in the reality of what protection you get from earplugs in that top bar chart. And the bottom one is reflecting different types of ear muffs, which are closer to the attenuation that's produced with the product, but certainly, again, still in some cases half of what would or should be expected. So we should not be over relying on PPE, and this is a big problem with the topic of noise in workplaces. We still heavily rely on hearing protection as probably our one and only source of intervention for the challenge of noise, and we need to shift that. We don't tolerate reliance on PPE, personal protective equipment, for any other exposure in workplaces. We look at it more critically, and that challenge that, for noise, we tend to quantify the problem. So we might spend a lot of money doing noise measurements and noise mapping and having noise consultants do reports for us. We provide people with lots of PPE, which we've just proven and shown is not effective. And then we cross our fingers and hope we don't get those claims coming through in the future. And just to recognise that EM, I've shortened as exposure monitoring. And so that kind of measurement and monitoring of exposure and health surveillance are only assurances, as I'm sure you're all aware, of our controls being effective. They are not a control measure. They are not an intervention in themselves. Neither exposure monitoring or health surveillance is going to protect anybody in the workplace unless we're doing something about our controls. And maybe a modern approach to this challenge would be to actually think about our workers' exposure beyond the workplace, to educate our workforce about their personal listening habits and their personal exposures and what that might look like. And I think as well to move beyond the only impact being hearing loss, but actually thinking about other impacts on people's health and well-being. And maybe we could gain more traction and more investment and more attention to this subject, as it deserves. Something I'm sure we're all familiar with, that what we should be doing is rigorously, I often say, rigorously challenging ourselves on whether or not we're applying the hierarchy of control. As I say, the default to PPE, to hearing protection in this particular workplace challenge, is unsustainable and unacceptable. And what we've done on the right hand side from the UKHCA is we've produced what the hierarchy of control looks like for noise, particularly in the example I've got here, in what it might look like in the construction sector. So what does elimination look like? What does reduction, keeping it quiet, look like? Isolate and control or mitigate, about turning it down or moving away. So trying to relate it to something practical, and then finally, once we've done some of the solutions higher up the chain, if you like, we then might use hearing protection to kind of deal with the residual risk. So we need more examples, and the context of today's session really is about setting the context of how we're working, how we're underperforming in this area, and I'm hopeful that my colleague Jill Cousins from the UKHCA will join us on one of these webinars in the future to talk in more detail about examples from this kind of hierarchy, and what it looks like, some case studies and examples of real life interventions and success. So I thought I'd talk you through again a little bit that kind of background about what's emerging from the recent and future inspections from the HSE, because there are some interesting findings in these. What I'll talk you through were presented at our UKHCA conference last year in November. So if you're not aware, the campaign really is about initially looking at hearing protection management, and they have been criticised, the HSE, to say, you shouldn't be focused on hearing protection if that's the lowest bar in terms of the hierarchy of control. But I think the regulator has recognised that, well, if that's where people are investing and kind of putting their priority in, we're going to show how effective or not effective that is, if that's where the industry and where the kind of cultural maturity is in terms of noise management. So again, if it's helpful, and if you've not seen this before, they're basically using this acronym of CUF with duty holders when asking questions about hearing protection management. So they're asking about the condition and whether the hearing protection is in a good state of repair when it's provided to people, whether people are using the hearing protection not only when it's needed, but all of the time that it's needed, which is a big challenge. People take them out. And again, I've got graphs and things to show that, just a small reduction in wear time can have a big impact on how much protective value people get from hearing protection. So it's essential that they are worn the whole time during that kind of harmful exposure. Does the hearing protection fit the ear? And in terms of fit, that means, is it worn correctly? Again, I've got slides and examples where they have it in standby mode, it's sort of in the pinner rather than in the ear canal, or the Shrek version where they're kind of sticking out. So are they, do they fit, and are they worn properly? And then are they fit for purpose? So has the hearing protection been selected for the environment, the exposure profile, and the individual worker needs? So as I say, that's something that they will use. It's a useful acronym to reflect on in terms of any hearing protection management systems that you have. The HSE are also currently doing quite a bit on occupational health provision and health surveillance. And again, this is certainly causing some interesting conversations with the occupational health community because they are being challenged on the quality of the audiometric test and the audiometric test environment. So pure tone audiometry is the test used to do noise health surveillance to see if people have got a hearing loss. There are questions around competency of people undertaking the tests themselves. So how qualified are they? How do they understand what they should be doing, and the quality assurance of the environment? Are they actually doing all they should to identify potential cases of noise-induced hearing loss? And do they understand the workplace that they are delivering occupational health in, and linking that kind of health outcomes being identified with the risk profile of that individual or the tasks that are being performed? So lots of questions and challenge around occupational health provision. In fact, they've said that for all the cases that are referred to a specialist, and this is both on noise exposure and kind of management of noise in the workplace and the health surveillance issues, all of those cases from inspections which were referred to a specialist, 100% of them are resulting in enforcement outcomes, 100%. Yeah, I guess they are focusing in an area which does need improvement, which is, say, shown up in those notices numbers. So again, some of the slides that the specialist inspector shared with us at our recent conference, just to show, compared to other health exposures, how important noise is. The majority of workplaces visited needed health surveillance for noise compared to the other health conditions and exposures. Another interesting outcome, again, how many people were trained. If we're relying on hearing protection, how many people are being educated in how to use them? Only 20% agreed that they had been trained in the use of hearing protection. And really interesting from a safety perspective, only 5% of employers had looked at issues around audibility. So the idea that we give people hearing protection and it might be really high protection values, we think we're doing the right thing, but we are isolating people, we're putting them at risk of not hearing vehicles, moving plant, co-workers, alarms, all those other things which we have in place to keep people safe. 95% of employers are not reflecting on audibility when they're relying on hearing protection, which, as I say, is really frightening in terms of risk outcome of noise in the workplace. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes. I've got a few slides on this, but I'll try and sort of whiz through them again, just reflecting on that kind of modern challenge around this topic, I guess, and something that might be fairly new and novel for us in our kind of risk assessment areas is the use of headphones in the workplace. So there is obviously a challenge around the context I provided before, that, you know, listening habits are completely different. When we do health surveillance for noise, you know, we're reflecting on data which is 50 plus years old, and that was population data of hearing level expectations back in the 70s, late 60s and 70s. The fact that our hearing listening habits, our age profile of the workforce, our need to work for longer has changed. We should really question, well, is it tolerable to say what the population looked like in the late 60s is our reference point for acceptable hearing for our population today? And also in terms of exposure limits, if we know people are consuming a lot more audible content in their lives, does the workplace limit really reflect the same risk? You know, are they too high for what people may already be bringing into the workplace? And to say anecdotally, there's certainly a lot of evidence that young people are kind of baselining in terms of their health already at 16, 17, 18 years of age, coming into work with a hearing loss which can be identified, which is, I say, fairly frightening. So listening at work, as I say, if heavy noisy industry has declined, you know, what's happening to these kind of listening habits? Many workers who are listening to content before they come to work will have possibly already had their whole day dose of noise. 1 hour of headphones at about 94 decibels will have hit your exposure limit target. And quite often people are listening at 100 decibels quite easily, especially on a noisy tube or noisy public transport, and that's only going to take about 15 minutes. And they've had the full noise dose, and then come to work, and then they're exposed again. So something to consider, probably in the round. As I say, does that create an increased safety issue if people already have a hearing loss at work? Are we more likely to have those hearing impaired workers and that kind of challenge of deafness, of people using hearing aids in our workplaces because of that increased kind of social profile? And just to say the context for some of that, to say, you know, this Ofcom report that estimates that adults in the UK are consuming around 5 hours of screen time, much of which will be plugged into headphones. And I'm sure most of us recognise that. And then there's listening at work, and there's probably two key specific areas here. But the challenge is, do we quantify this? Do we recognise it, that people are listening to content at work? Some people will be listening to content for their work, so that, like a call centre example, or listening to other content, meetings all day, having high levels of noise possibly. But many people also listen to content their own personal content. So you'll know possibly or recognise the issue of people going to work and listening to their own music or podcasts to block out background noise. And we've even had examples of people who, plug in their AirPods or whatever others are available under their muffs. And so they're protecting their ears from the environmental noise in the workplace. So in construction, lots of heavy noise going on, but they're also kind of drowning that out with their listening to music or whatever else they're listening to. And some employers might not even be aware that that's happening and all the issues and risks that would bring with it. So there've been some questions asked around the UKHCA about, well, could an employer be liable for people listening to their own content at work? I think it would be a stretch, but there's certainly a kind of risk profile and an added possible risk to people's health and safety under our watch if they're listening to their own personal content in the workplace. So what can be done if it is a noisy environment? So if we do have noisy workplaces, then obviously we need to reduce that. So if we're requiring people to listen to content, that should be included in our risk assessments. If we're permitting people to listen to their own content, again, I think there should be something around the risk that might create, and some policy or position on whether that's permitted, whether that's okay, whether that can be done safely. I sound like the fun police, but I mean, going back in the day where it used to be the radio in the corner of the factory or whatever, that was the biggest noise source. You turn the blooming radio off and we can turn down the noise. It's probably something similar really in this context, but it's probably less obvious and less visible, people hearing, listening on personal devices. So we've got a few resources that may help in terms of some of these issues that I've raised today. So do have a kind of mooch on our UKHCA website. I'll put some links up in a second. We've got this fit testing poster, and we've got a few others about using personal listening devices in the workplace, or the question that we were asked about, can I use my own noise cancelling listening devices to protect my hearing at work? No, you cannot. So we do have a poster for that as well. And also some advice on fit testing. Any of you who work with respiratory protection will be familiar with the requirement to fit test any close fitting respirators. And hearing protection, if it's in ear, hearing protection is exactly the same, particularly within ear anyway, plugs, in that, people have different size ear canals. They might have different sizes in each ear, but population-wise, we have different shapes of ear canals. So the concept around fit testing, again, is if you're relying on hearing protection, this is an assurance scheme, if you like, to say it does fit the individual, they can fit it properly, they can achieve that attenuation rate for that plug or earmuff, and we have an assurance scheme and a process to do that. So that guidance is available, which talks about the different types of hearing fit testing equipment available and the pros and cons for those. So what does the future look like? I guess, we need to get smarter around our approach to noise. There are many kind of new innovations coming on the market. We do need to challenge ourselves in this subject. We do need to move away from over-reliance on PPE and look more at noise at source control, buying quiet, mitigating those noise levels from the source of their creation. But hopefully, as I said before, with the focus from the regulator, the increase in attention in terms of the holistic health outcomes of these exposures, I'm hoping that it is a time for change and development and protecting general health and hearing health for the future. So a few links and follows to ask for, if you like, so you can find our website there. We're on LinkedIn. We don't tend to use Twitter very much, but if you're a Twitter user, there's our Twitter handle. And a bit of a plug for our conference this year. We've run about 4 or 5 of these now, and they've always proved really popular and successful. So if you're interested in taking a snap of the screen QR code there, you'll find more out about our conference coming up this November in Manchester. And I'll leave it there for now, and see if there's any questions or comments on the kind of quick whiz through that I've presented to you today. So I hope you found it interesting.
Graham's just coming on to ask the questions. We're just
Yes, apologies for being late. Yeah, I had a Wi-Fi meltdown at work, so we're back on now. So I'll try my video. It's not working very well, I'm afraid. Having all sorts of IT problems. I'm on a spare IT at the moment, so you may not see me, which is a good thing for you. So very quickly, I've got some really good. And by the way, that was excellent, Claire. I'd really like some of those or all of those slides, but if we can access them at all, if you're able to share.
Yeah.
So I'm working backwards up the list, but got some really excellent comments, very interesting, encouraging. Michelle says open plan office working is a challenge. People are using earphones to block out background noise. They're trying to concentrate, so they use the excuse that they need the headset on. They're listening to music. Often, I certainly can hear a colleague regularly playing quite loud music through there. But what I'm in manufacturing at the moment, but I've come from rail, and in rail, MP3s were generally banned. We obviously they're not always called MP3s these days, but personal devices they were banned because they were a distraction. So you couldn't be in any form of rail environment with them, and they were banned on site completely. So even in office areas, they were frowned upon. So yeah, I think more employers should be taking that stance, really, seeing them as a distraction, not able to hear fire alarms clearly, not able to hear, if you're crossing a car park or something and you hear a vehicle. So yeah, it's too many people are still seen using personal devices. It is one of my problem areas where I am currently.
Yeah, I think obviously there's a personal safety issue, but when that's translated into the workplace, I think employers, by ignoring it and sort of leaving people to their own devices, are potentially, storing up some issues. So I think it's just looking at that challenge and providing individuals with some advice, but also maybe thinking about the environment and having a policy on, well, actually, you shouldn't be listening to your own personal devices in this context because
yes,
that creates a risk for others, it creates a risk for you. But if actually you want to listen to your own personal devices because it blocks out background noise, it helps you to concentrate, or for whatever personal reason, that's fine. But did you know, here's some helpful advice for you for personal listening, because you could be really doing yourself more harm than good. So it's trying not to kind of overstep your boundaries within workplaces, but actually having a policy on where it shouldn't be used because there are other issues, or giving people individual advice, because lots of people who listen to content all day have no idea that they're affecting their hearing.
Yeah, really good point. As a few people have said, it's often you have to turn up above the background, and then and people are more on, as you gave good examples of tubes or situations where they're doing that certainly outside of work very regularly, so they just take that habit into work. And it's about, as you say, explaining why it's important not to do that, and why we're just asking reasonably that you think before you do. and breaking that habit. Rose asks a really good question around how would you prove that people are listening to their own content? You know, I've got an example where I challenged somebody recently. They said, well, I'm listening to a podcast and it's about what we're currently doing. So, you know, it's related to this project that you and I are working on together. So, you know, you should listen to it as well. And I said, well, just not walking around, you know, you're walking around listening to the podcast, you're not concentrating on other things in a busy environment. So yeah, but their view was that actually it was a good thing to allow people to listen to podcasts and those sort of things. But it's just getting, in that case, I just said, you know, can I just reasonably ask then you sit down and you listen and you concentrate to the podcast rather than actually marching around.
Yeah, I think Rose's point is sort of I presume, Rose, correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, it's that kind of hidden exposure, and then individuals maybe in the future claiming or going to the health surveillance check and saying, well, you've caused my hearing loss, and how far does the employer go to prove or disprove? And I think that's quite often the challenge where we are relying on hearing protection, and when the evidence shows us that hearing protection doesn't work or is likely not to work. So, as an employer, if you've got no other defence than to say, I gave you hearing protection, but maybe they've not been trained in it, and maybe they're not using it all the time, and maybe they're going to pull out the evidence that, yes, but it's still a noisy workplace and it wasn't working very well, you've kind of not got a strong defence to say, but you've been listening to your own content all day at work. You go home and, you know, I don't know, use motorcycles or gaming all night listening to loud
Yeah,
noise. You know, if you've got a strong, robust noise management, hearing conservation approach in your workplace, you can quite easily defend that and say, this must be your problem, your personal choices in your listening habits, because we've done everything as an employer to reduce that exposure. So that I think that would kind of be my response there, if that was kind of the kind of proof of liability, if you like.
yeah. I just had one question myself, Claire, around you know, when you employ, we've just employed here a hygienist to do we have annual noise assessments in different areas, rotate the areas, and we've got some here in conservation zones, and yeah, basically we you know, we'll just do the standard thing, I guess, which is get them in, they'll do their type 2 measurements, they'll do their dosimetry, they won't do any in-ear measurements, they won't they make brief observations occasionally about people wearing, but you know, they're not, for me, doing enough really to help with this issue of people not wearing the hearing protection correctly, or and I wondered what your view is around how we can, you know, engage the hygienist to help us with that.
Yeah, and I think there's occupational hygiene, but I mean, I've always been quite an advocate for occupational health at health surveillance appointments. I think
Yeah,
any opportunity where you have a one-to-one conversation with somebody about health or safety, um, you know, it's a chance to engage with them. And if you're undertaking a health surveillance check for noise, for example, you know, you can talk to them and say, "Do you know, this isn't looking too great, you know, at the moment, or actually it looks fine at the minute, but do you know how to wear your hearing protection?" You know, you could implement a kind of a fit testing program to show people, you know, and to have that more uh, quality conversation. You know,
yeah,
look, you're not wearing, I mean, this is the problem with audiometry, is that it's quite lagging and latent and people don't really take it very seriously. Yes, you've passed your hearing test. Yeah, but I can't hear in reality. So you get a tick from your health surveillance check, so you've passed,
yeah,
basically. And you walk away to yourself thinking, oh, great, I must be fine. But you know, you're not
yeah,
really hearing properly. So it's opportunities, whether it's through occupational hygiene, you know, people getting clagged up with their dosimeters to have a conversation with, say, you know, you're not wearing that properly. whether in health surveillance, whether it's other opportunities to talk about hearing and it's not just hearing loss. Do you know how isolating hearing loss is? It's not just to turn it up with a hearing aid. So yeah, anything we can do really to have those more engaging, quality conversations around the topic.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think occupational health could, here that we tend to, where I'm at the moment, they wouldn't mind me saying, we cram as many people as possible in the day, to a day of audiometry, and the area that the audiometry is carried out in. It's not a booth, it's a quiet area, but there are occasional door slams and things, and it's not, I would say, the perfect environment, but it's the best environment the employer has available. So yeah, and yeah, there's not enough discussion between the occupational health nurse and the certainly I've just recently had mine been for my test, and yeah, it's a fairly rushed experience.
Yeah, it can be. Like you say, it's probably not a quality test based on the environment, but we can still use the opportunity, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. And then Michelle asks about, do you know any good assessment models related to exposure and whole body effects, ill health effects, or is that something we need to develop further as a community? What's your experience in that?
I mean, when we do health surveillance for noise, we do usually, or typically, the OH provider will ask general health questionnaires.
Yeah,
I am particularly interested in the prevalence of tinnitus. We did do some research at HSE, which found that the majority of people who have noise-induced hearing loss also suffer from tinnitus. We
yes,
know tinnitus is related to noise exposure, but we're not, we don't have a kind of clear dose response relationship. And obviously, tinnitus is, again, incurable, affects people in different ways. But I'm not sure of a tool or a health surveillance measure which could kind of, apart from self-reported, people reporting tinnitus, I think we could get better at just asking questions and
mm,
making that conversational link that, we've asked you these questions because we know from the evidence that a lot of this stuff is related to noise and sound exposure.
yeah.
If you're suffering, just think about this in the round. I think we rely on pure tone audiometry because it's a very well established check of hearing, which can be repeated, which is important for health surveillance. It's a test you can repeat and reflect and look back on any changes. So I think there's a challenge around looking at other health effects because of that, having a good test which would be repeatable in the workplace. But I think we can certainly ask questions and reflect on the feedback from that questionnaire with individuals to say, did you understand this could be linked or related to either hearing loss or exposure to sound?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, do you think there's any more could be done with noise awareness in the workplace? Because obviously, where I am at the moment, they use an e-learning. Actually, it's a video standard material, just to give everybody a flavour, and it does kind of touch on tinnitus, but it's mostly about hearing loss.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just wondered what your view is around noise awareness and whether any more could be done to make that more effective.
Yeah. And I think that's been the challenge with this topic is that people, you can imagine, yourself, if you tell anybody there's asbestos in their work environment or their social environment or in their school, people are horrified.
Mm,
It's a latent disease. The risk can be fairly low if the asbestos is in well-maintained conditions, but people are still frightened because the thought of dying from that cancer is horrendous, and people would not want to experience it. So it frightens people, and people are risk averse appropriately. When it comes to noise, and you say you might get deaf when you're older, people go, yeah, so what? go a bit deaf. You know, it doesn't motivate or move people. If we talk to people about what deafness actually feels like and how it isolates us from our friends, our family, our communities, it stops us doing our hobbies. You know, it might come with tinnitus, which means you won't sleep. You know, or you'll not be able to concentrate. You know, it might come with other mental health effects. You might be at increased risk of dementia. You know, it's a stressor at lower levels where, you know, all the health effects that are associated with stress. You know, maybe people will start to it seems that people take it a lot more seriously. So it links to that kind of workplace advice, but also personal advice. You know, I see little kids, you know, you're plugged into their iPads, and again they're on a plane and they've turned it up really loud, and you think their poor little delicate ears. And I've been a parent. I am a parent, but I've been a parent of little ones, and you'll do anything to keep them quiet. I understand that, but not understanding the potential repercussions, which is what a lot of our job is all about, isn't it?
It is. It is. Brilliant. Does anybody else have any questions for Claire?
I think I've put my personal email, or not my personal email, my work's email, or contact details on there. So I'm happy for anyone to kind of get in touch afterwards. I'm
Brilliant.
happy to share my email address with people if they've got any other questions or comments.
Thank you. That was excellent.
problem.
Thank you. Tam, do you have anything to say? No? Okay.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. No, thank you very much, Claire. That was amazing.
No worries.
Really good. Thank you.